Good afternoon, and this is a fresh conversation, but this conversation is brought to you by Embry-Riddle University and VyStar Credit Union. Today, we are interviewing K.I. Knight, the award-winning author of Fate and Freedom, The Middle Passage, books 1, 2, and 3, and Unveiled, the 20 and Odd. Welcome to the Many Facets of Black History, sponsored by Embry-Riddle and VyStar Credit Union. My name is Donna Gray Banks, and I am the founder director of Fresh Book Festival, and I have the pleasure of interviewing K.I. Knight. Once again, we met several months ago, and it is my pleasure to have you here this afternoon. Welcome.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me. My name is Catherine Knight. I'm an international award-winning author using the pen name K.I. Knight, like Donna said. I'm a practicing genetic genealogy, a 1619 historian, a board member for several national nonprofit organizations across America. I'm a member of many genealogy and historical societies. I'm a certified cemetery preservationist. So in my meantime, I rehabilitate historical cemeteries. A bit more specifically about my work. In 2015, after about 20,000 hours plus or minus of research, I wrote a series of books on the first Africans to arrive in Virginia in 1619. Last year, my series won the Independent Publishers Book Award for Best Series of the Year for 2020. So I was excited about that. And in addition, I've written a research or reference book entitled Unveiled, the 20 and Odd, documenting the first Africans in Virginia from 1619 to 1625 and beyond. And this book has also won numerous commendations in the last 2 years. So I'm really excited to be here with you to share the information that I have on the history that has been uncovered just in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so my first question is, tell us why you felt this story had to be told and why you decided to take it on as a historical journey for yourself.
Well, the first part of that question is, why did I feel the story had to be told? First of all, I was a pretty good history student, and I didn't remember a single thing about the first Africans. I don't believe it was told. I don't.
It was never told.
Exactly. So, as a genealogist, this path started for me as a genealogist, doing research on my husband's genealogy. He is a descendant of one of these first Africans. So when I found them, it was very intriguing because I wanted to know who they were, how did they get to Virginia, what were they doing there before the Mayflower had come to Plymouth? I mean, who were these Africans? So, like I said, after 20,000 hours of discovering who they were, I decided I knew more probably than anybody else about them. I knew names. I knew what they did on a daily basis. I knew where they lived, how they got from point A to point B. So it became an addiction, if you want to know the honest truth. I was addicted to knowing who they were, why they came, how they arrived here, because it was really an anomaly. They did not come the way that you would think of contemporary history. It was really an anomaly how they came. It was due to a pirate attack on a Spanish slave ship.
Okay, so that was one of the questions. How was it that the route was chosen to drop people off? And now you're just leading right into that. So go ahead.
It wasn't a normal route. Virginia had never had any Africans. This was literally a piracy of 2 English ships on a Spanish ship. Now, I wondered why, at that time, because Virginia had no slaves, slavery wasn't legal. Why did they target this ship? Was it for the slaves? So what I want to bring in here is you really have to look at the who, how, where, and why. And when you look at that, I want to move to the side because I want you to see the painting in the background. That's a painting I commissioned in 2010, and it is called The Battle of the San Juan Bautista. It's 2 ships attacking a Spanish galleon. Now, The reason I'm telling you this is because I needed to know what that Spanish galleon looked like. Slave ships are not galleons. They are not warships. And that's what actually this ship was. So I decided to really look to figure out why these two ships attacked it. And really, it should have been carrying gold. It should have, and it was in a path from Mexico, which we know is modern day Mexico. It's really New Spain back then.
Right.
So it was going from to their homeland, and on that, it was within that same track. That's where this ship ended up. That they were actually, there were slaves on it. Now they had been enslaved in Angola, and that is a very important story also to tell of even how they became enslaved, because Angola at the time was a Portuguese colony. The Portuguese had taken over in the late 1500s. A new governor had been appointed to the colony in 1618, and he came in and they actually found silver under the kingdom of Ndongo. And it was actually at the capital, which was the city of Cabasa. And it was an international trading market. And that is important. We're going to come back to that. But just remember, it was an international trading market. So when they attacked them, they took the people, they enslaved them because they were trying to get to the silver. Now, whether or not on this specific incident, the Africans actually that were there knew that the attack was going to happen and the kingdom would fall, I don't know. There has been, there's been historians that have said that many of the Africans were sold by their own people. In this case, I say they were not, because it was an attack on the capital by the Portuguese. They rounded up everybody. They disrobed them. You couldn't tell if they were royal. You couldn't tell if they were servants. They marched them 300 miles to the port of Luanda. Once they got there, they put them on 36 different ships. 30 of those ships went to Brazil. Of them went to Mexico, which was New Spain. Now, again, you have to think, why did they go to two separate places? Well, part of those were was a Portuguese colony, which was Brazil. So those ships were under Portuguese rule. Those were Portuguese ships. The ships that went to New Spain were Spanish ships. That was a Spanish port that they were taking, they were going. Now, on their way to Spain, or to New Spain, and they were in the Bay of Campeche. They were 500 miles from their destination. The ship was pirated by the two English warships. That's how that journey started, because when they were put on the ship, they were enslaved. When they, if they would have gotten to their destination, they would have been enslaved because they were going to work in the silver mines in Mexico. We know that they were going to Veracruz. So, the ship eventually, or I should say the captain, another ship, and all the rest of the Africans from Angola arrived in Veracruz in the late August. When they arrived there, the ship captain notated on the receipt of the slaves that were sold that 60 had been pirated. He said they were taken, and he describes the event. So we have that information. So it's literally what I had to do with this entire journey and how they arrived in Virginia. It was a puzzle, and I had to put it back together because there's only little bits of pieces. But this puzzle is consumed by 8 countries on 4 different continents. So the puzzle is great. It's the San Juan Bautista that I mentioned that actually picked up the Africans, the 350 Africans on the coast of Luanda, and was raided by the 2 English corsairs. That ship was originally from Japan. So when I identified that ship, how it got into the Spanish hands, what it looked like, I then could have this picture painted because I knew what the ship looked like. Well, lo and behold, it was the second ship to cross the Pacific, the second galleon type sailing ship for the Japanese. It sailed across the Pacific in 1615. That was the very first journey. It was built specifically to take someone to Mexico, and then they went on to their journey, but it was specifically for that. There is a museum called the San Juan Bautista Museum in Ichimaki, Japan. And ship has actually been reconstructed. You can actually walk onto the ship and see exactly where they would have been laying, where they would have been transported, where they would have actually been inside that ship. So the when, the how, and the where, and the who always comes in. It's very important to figure out the entire journey. They just didn't arrive on a slave ship like many, many others did following that. The first Africans, it was really, their journey was an anomaly. It wasn't the normal journey. That is one reason I had to tell the story, because it wasn't normal. These Africans were very, very important to the history of Virginia. And that was really the reason behind it. The story hadn't been told, and they needed to be able to take their true place in history because they were important. Without them, I believe that America would be South Canada. I do not believe that Virginia would have been colonized in 1623-24 without these first Africans. So they're very important. The story had to be told to get it out there of what happened. And the 400th anniversary was 2019, where we were able to celebrate them. Actually, we commemorated their journey. We spoke their names for the first time. So it's emotional for me just to even talk about it still, because to speak their names, it gives them power again. It gives them their place in history. So it's important.
So when you talk about accountability, a lot of people think that there was never any accountability for the people who were on these ships. But tell us about the manifests that were kept during this time.
We only, actually, there is not a manifest. What we have is we have a receipt for where the Africans were purchased in Luanda, 350 of them. We have a receipt where they were sold in Virginia, or excuse me, in Mexico, which is New Spain. We have letters from the people in charge in Virginia going back to England that tells us who arrived where they were put. There is census records. There's what's called the list of the living that has actual names on it. And from those names, I was able to take them and actually put their lives back together, know who they were, how they got from one plantation to another. So the smallest of just the first name on a list, these Africans became the first free people of color. Because of how they arrived, they actually arrived and they were called maritime contraband. They were stolen off of a ship that they had no right to. So they actually didn't arrive as slaves. When they arrived, they became servants. There wasn't any such thing as slavery in what became America. The only reference to slavery that we find in those times was a punishment that there was 2 instances in another English colony, which was Bermuda. And those instances were instances of punishment. One of someone had hurt a child, so he was enslaved to the colony. The other one had voted against the governor and had said derogatory things about the governor, and he was enslaved to the governor for his words that he said. So it was always a punishment, slavery. So when they arrived in Virginia, they were servants like others, and they are identified as servants. They end up becoming, they actually end up becoming landowners. Some of them were cattle barons. They were very, very important to the colony. And my books show that information. Is very documented. There's a series right now of 3 books that I have, and it's book 1, book 2, and book 3. Here's the 3 of them. There's going to be a 4th one that comes out, which is right there. And it's called the research companion for the series, because I wanted, as a genealogist, we hate fiction, even though I wrote this entire series is considered still historical fiction because I wrote it in first person. It's about 95% factual, and that's why I wrote the research companion, so you can see and understand how I tell the story, where I got the information from, and how it unfolds, because their story is one that needs to be known. If it wasn't for these Africans, I'm 100% sure we would not be in the United States of America. Virginia, that colony, would never have been
established in the first place. So the 350, do we know how many actually made it?
Okay, there was 60 that ended up being raided from the pirate ship. There was 2 pirate ships, so they were split 30 and 30. The 2 ships, and in my book, Unveiled the 20 and Odd, which is the research book, I released this book specifically for the 400th anniversary because it gives the specific route. It actually gives, I was able to figure out the average speed of the ship on the distances because of when they arrived. We knew that it had hit a storm. One of the ships was damaged. It arrived several days after the first ship, but on these ships, it gives all the information of who was where and how they were sold. And they were sold, it says they were sold, but here's what I want to look at. And I still contemplate if they were actually what you want to call sold, like in contemporary history with 17 and 1800s. It's because in 1620, the owner of one of the ships, and well, let me just back up. The owner of the San Juan Bautista, which was the ship that was Spanish slave ship that was pirated, it was owned by the Spanish ambassador to the King of England.
The Spanish ambassador to the King of England. Okay.
That's how we knew, number one, the ship was Spanish, not Portuguese. I tracked his genealogy. He's definitely Spanish. And then I tracked the ship, and I can tell how it got from Japan, specifically the Philippines, which was under Spanish rule, and given to the King of Spain, Philip III. And then he basically gave it to his ambassador, whose name was Gondomar. And Gondomar is the one, he actually filed a lawsuit against the pirates in England. So we know how many how many they took, which was 60. They divided them 30 and 30. There is maps I have made that shows you what directions the ships took. One ship went immediately to Virginia. The other one was blown off course by a storm, like I said, and it ended up in Bermuda. That was the White Lion. The White Lion arrived actually first in Virginia because it took that second ship, the Treasure, a long time to get there because it had been damaged in the storm. So one ship was blown off course to Bermuda. The other one went directly to Virginia, but it took the second ship almost 12 days longer because the first ship arrived in Bermuda and then sailed to Virginia. And then 3 days after that is when the second ship landed. So we can actually track and see the speed of the ship. We know when they arrived in Bermuda. 14 of them stayed in Bermuda. They were given to another captain, and that captain said that he had found them floating on the seas. Well, we know that didn't happen. There's other documentation since in testimony that tells where they came from. Actually, the Africans say they came from the captain of that White Lion ship. He's named. So there's a lot of information out there, but you have to literally take the archives of 8 different countries and put the bits and pieces together to reconstruct the puzzle, because it is so important. The history of it is so important. It actually, 8 different countries. You have Japan, you have Jamaica, you have Angola, you have Portugal, you have Spain, you have Bermuda, you have England, and all of them led to Virginia being colonized. Now, if one of those, say, cogs in the wheel was taken out, it wouldn't have happened. It's amazing that the whole entire project happened to begin with. It was an anomaly. That's why I say that. If one instance would have been taken out of that pattern that the ships traveled, it wouldn't have happened the way it did. America may not have been America.
How many of these people were children?
I believe many of them were under the age, let's say, of 15 years old. I know that one of them probably, who I've done much research and who is my husband's ancestor, her name was Margaret. She took the last name of Cornish. And that had to do with the ship captain that took them off the ship in the San Juan Bautista. He was from Cornwall. And I've tracked her specifically. She is one actually that ended up in England She went to England for a period, probably 3 months, and then she was shipped back in one of the plantations in Virginia later. But it's just a matter of taking. You have to look at each ship. Where did they go? Where did they sail? Who was on board? And you can begin to put the story together. It's an amazing journey, really.
And so it was probably easier to dictate what to do when you're talking about children instead of adults, right? So,
oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so that made it easier for them to.
Because they were maritime contraband also. Because of that, they couldn't enslave them, and they could only stay on they were sold to the governor, and they were sold to the Cape merchant when they arrived, and they were actually weren't sold, they were traded for victual is what the document said, which is food. So when they were traded, they were put upon these 2 plantations. They remained there until the deaths of those plantation owners, which was in 1627. At the same time, Gondomar, who had the lawsuit against the pirate ship, also passed away. There was 3 people that died all in 1 year, which was the plantation owners that had the Africans and the owner of the San Juan Bautista that had been pirated. So at that point, that's in 1628, the beginning of the following year, I see documentation where those Africans are transferred and become actual indentured servants, and there is documentation. 7 years later, they become, that indenture is removed, and it talks about an indenture, the signed contract.
Mm-hmm.
So they had contracts, and those indentures were removed, and they became free people of color. They own their own properties. And it took several years for the process, but it took several years for the process for every single person in that colony. If you arrived there, you had to pay for your passage, and if you couldn't pay for it, you were basically.
How do you pay for your passage? That's crazy.
Yeah, you became a servant. whoever bought you, basically.
Right,
so
right.
They were actually one step up on the English servants, because the English servants, number one, had no knowledge. They didn't come from an area like Virginia. England is not like Virginia at all. Virginia had to be cultivated into an area that they could even grow crops, because they had to cut down trees. They had to maneuver the ground. There was all kinds of stuff that had to be done. The Africans had the knowledge of doing this because their environment in Angola was very similar to what went on in Virginia. And again, I say, if it hadn't been for them, the United States would not be what it is. They were the ones that were able to keep this information, to allow the English to even have the information. They taught them how to grow crops. They taught them how to raise swine and to have cows and horses and to grow crops. They had all this knowledge. The English didn't. The English were coming out of prisons, out of the streets of England and London. So how did they didn't know anything about growing crops, nothing. They didn't know how to raise livestock, but these Africans did. And in 1622, they proved it. And we'll talk about that probably later when we get there. So, but I want to
we can talk about that now. Come on, just go with it. It's a nice
flow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in 1622, there's a native uprising. And the reason for the uprising was because the English were expanding across the river onto the natives' land where they grew crops. So the natives were very angry, and they burned out, they killed many of the English. Now, we have no record of them harming the first African. I just want to say that.
Right.
But what we do see is there was 80 plantations up and down the James River, which was the transportation, was the river. So out of that 80 plantations, because of the raid was so great, it destroyed 1/3 of the settlement. 347 people were killed. So when that happened, those 80 plantations were pulled down to 8 so that they could have a defense against the natives to protect themselves. Now, out of those 8 plantations, we have the Africans, all of them on one. That one plantation provided enough food and enough crops It was the only one of the 8 that had enough area to grow enough crops to provide food for the people of Virginia. Now, who do you think, and you can look at the list on that actually was there. There's a document, the list of the living. It says every single person that's living at Florida Plantation, which is where they were. Well, guess what? All of the Africans were there. All of the rest of the people. There was, besides this one incident of the natives uprising, there was a ship that came in December of 1622 after that. So the colony was, the settlement was already devastated from this uprising. Well, when this ship came, which was the Abigail, in December of 1620, it brought disease. So it killed more people. So they were more devastated. It also brought a lot of people. There was other ships arriving between 1619 and 1622, but still people didn't know how to take care of themselves. They didn't know how to grow crops. They didn't know how any lives take care of the livestock to do any of it. So who did on this plantation? When you look at the list of the living that was compiled in February of 1623 and look at every single person on there, I can document where they came from. I can also document they knew nothing. The Africans are who provided the food. I've had a lot of kickback from other historians, and I challenge them. I say, look who was there. You tell me who was growing the crops, who was providing the food. It was the Africans, and they were all on one plantation, the bulk of them. Yes, there was a few scattered here and there, and we know how they got there of those 2, and that's all documented and unveiled. But for the bulk of the Africans, they were on the Florida plantation, and they were the ones that provided the food. So we know that they were very relevant to the settlement. That we know that if they hadn't done that, I don't believe that Virginia would have lasted. They weren't even allowed to return to their plantations until the following year. There was so much that had gone on. And then the natives, they continued to harass the English, which they had to do right. It was their property. I mean, they had the property.
Right.
But they continued for years until the 1630s is when it let up, but then it started again in the 1640s. So I truly, like I said, believe those first Africans, without them, it brought a lot of criminal court cases down upon the investors of the company. It was a company back then. The settlement it was an actual colony. And there was investors, and those investors had to go to court, criminal court, over the allegations of what happened. And so we have that documentation. So it's very important, though, that we begin with to really understand how slavery evolves, because here's what happened. When those Africans, became very important. They saved their lives, right? But as more English came into Virginia over and over from ships, more ships came every week, every month. They weren't recognized like they were in the early 1620s for saving anybody. All those people died. It wasn't known. And then more people came in from England, and I believe that they felt threatened because the Africans knew so much. So every time the Africans would advance, the new English court system would take them back 2 steps because they would enforce a law to change the progression. When they could,
that hasn't changed much.
So it did until the 1700s. There was a period from 1619 to 1701 that it was the Africans were prevalent then, and they were so important. And then because of their knowledge, their abilities, evil came to be. And that's when the slavery began, is because English thought they couldn't live without them. They were so important. And I feel like and to me, that makes slavery worse, because they knew what they did, and they still did everything they could to stop them and enslave them and keep them on their plantations, making them money. The first plantation, this is a good little statistic. In 1619, they arrived. Prior to 1619, there was not a single plantation that made an ounce of profit. In 1621, the two plantations the Africans were on with the Cape Merchant and the governor were now making money. So they were quite a commodity, so to speak. I mean, that's why I believe slavery happened, is because they realized how important that they were to keeping Virginia alive. And if they lost them, they were in trouble. And so that's where the sins of the evil to me comes in. To me, this is much worse than just getting the Africans just automatically being brought here as slaves and be brought from Africa, where they were sold from their captives. This is much worse, because we have to acknowledge what they did, and then they're going to turn around and enslave them. It's horrific. So I don't take anything away from contemporary slavery, but to me, when you add what happened, who these people were, what they did, it's much more horrific.
So this particular journey started everything else.
Yes.
Right, with the Middle Passage and all that, right?
This journey was the first Middle Passage and the longest Middle Passage of record. In 2019, the Sons and Daughters of the U.S. Middle Passage gave me the Phyllis Wheatley Literary Award for Unveiled. And because it finally gives names and sources and puts together the puzzle. Ask me your question again. I'm sorry.
I said this particular instance started pretty much everything else, from Africans coming through the Middle Passage and being brought over as contraband, because the knowledge and the fact that they really were used as commerce, right? To build the country, right?
Yep.
So
they are responsible for building America from the beginning. Let me say that, from the beginning. From the ground up. They were responsible. Yep. They have built everything within this country has been touched by the hands of the African people.
So let's talk about the 20 and odd. So when you do your research on that group of 20 people, can you find anybody now connected to them, or did they kind of just die out?
Oh no, there is a lot of people connected. In, I want to say 2016 or 15, I started a DNA data bank, because I began to see, I started finding people through genealogy, and that's where I get the practicing genetic genealogist now, is because I took the DNA of many, many people that believe, because now I can name these original people. They actually married into the natives and the English. And by doing that, they actually, within DNA today, I can actually see little tiny bits in white people of this Angolan DNA. And it has to be only a tiny, tiny bit, because we're talking 8, 9 generations back. And by that point, it's less than 1%. But if you look at each chromosome, you can actually see that DNA. I specifically have it. I did not know that until after I'd written all these books, been addicted for 14 years of what I was doing. But it started with my husband and his DNA, and I found it in his DNA. And I started matching people up. The more people that gave me their DNA just to check it, I was able to match it. And then we were able to match it to specific Africans. To, like, one of them was Emmanuel Driggers. He actually, I call him the very first.
The Driggers of the land?
Oh, there's Driggers all over the United States. Every one of them, if their name is Driggers and not Rodriguez, it's Driggers.
Driggers.
That is a descendant of the first Africans, without question.
Wow.
There's several of those names that we can just pick right out and know that they are the descendants. A big one would be John Gowen, and it's spelled in many, many different ways. As genealogists, we know that it depends on who wrote it down and how they heard it. it could be GOINS, it could be GOWEN, it could be, there's several different ways that it's
phonetically.
spelled.
Yeah, right.
Those Goins go back to John Gowen. He is documented early on in 1622. He's documented on one of the plantations that was associated with the owner of the treasure, the pirate ship. So these little spots that we can match things up to get an association is very important, because that's where I started and was able to confirm down the road this information. How did they get from A to Z? Well, this person actually, for instance, the man's name was William Ewens, and it's spelled E-W-E-N-S. It's not Evans, it's Ewen, E-W. So he actually was one that went to see the treasure when it arrived. There's documentation that he was one that went to see it. Well, then we have, that was in August. In September, we have several of those Africans listed on his land patent.
Right.
So I know that that's how he got them. There's no question. He would have met with them. So there's little pieces of this puzzle all over the world, literally. You can go to Japan, you can find it in Spain, was a big one. England, there's tons of records there. But unless you put it all together, you're not going to get the picture. And that's why I had to do it. It hadn't been done. And to me, it was so important to speak these people's names, to know who they were. And there are millions of descendants today. I had in my database, I had over 2,000 DNA descendants, which I could verify from many of those Africans.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how people really still believe that the Civil War had something to do with slavery. It had nothing to do with slavery. It was about money.
It's always about money. If you follow the money, that's the golden rule.
Right.
Follow the money.
Money, power, and we're going to talk about the other thing. But yeah, so I don't understand why people have this fallacy that it was about slavery. It was about money. It was about commerce. It was about having these people taken off of their plantations and changing their way of life.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So when I'm out and about, and I've traveled extensively, someone will say, God, I know somebody who looks just like you. And I think, well, yeah, she probably is, in the DNA, because that's just, yeah.
I have a picture. I wish I could show it to you right now. It's of a lady unquestionably of African and Native descent. And she looks identical to my daughter. Right. And I did not know where my daughter got her looks from. And everybody sees her, they're like, oh my gosh.
Is that your daughter?
Yeah.
Who does she belong to?
She looks just like her. And that is her fourth great grandmother. Wow. So it's in the genes, it's in the DNA. We all have it, whether you suffer from anxiety or stress or lots of medical issues. It comes from our DNA. DNA is huge. And emotions are key.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, and you can check those too, but that, we have to do that at another time.
Yeah, we will.
Yeah. So when we talk about the 20 and odd, tell me about the descendants that you know about. Just, maybe not way back then, but do you know anybody that we can correlate to like right now?
Oh, yes. Actually, I wrote in the Journal of the African American Historical and Genealogical Society in 2019.
Yes, you did.
We have many members of the Genealogical Society that are descendants and that I have matched up in my DNA database. Now, since I had that database, GEDmatch, which is a free genealogical DNA site that you can go on your computer, is gedmatch.com. There are many of follow-up DNA.
Are you saying GEN match? GEN match.
GEN match. GED.
GED. GED match. Okay.
But there's a lot on there because I do not have the database anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I've moved on to other things with DNA, and I just didn't have the ability to continue as one person doing it. But GEDmatch has picked it up, and there you can confirm your lines on there. There's lots of people. There is, I do have, and I continue to post on a Facebook account that I have. It's called 1619 Genealogy, Descendants of the 20 and Odd. And the 20 and Odd is what they were called when they arrived in Virginia. And the reason they were called that is because they were trying to hide the number of the
People.
Africans that came because of the lawsuits that were happening. But we have several lines of DNA. We know who they are. I believe the conference last year it was online because of the COVID, but I believe this year it might be held in October, and we will once again be commemorating those lines. There are, like I said, many, many people. There's a man named Andre Kearns. He's an awesome historian, and he has his lines on, you can Google them. Rick Murphy, he is a Goan descendant. He is the historian for the African American Historical and Genealogical Society. He's also written a book. I've studied and worked with him in a lot of in depth on the subject matter. But there's lots of historians that have worked on it, but not specifically naming them. And I thought it was important to tell their names and speak their names. We do I would say probably not 9 out of 10, 90%, I think I can name. There are 2 women that I have not been able to name. And of course it's women because we, as a woman, we didn't mean
wasn't
as
important.
much.
To know her name wasn't important, right?
I can guess who they were because of their status and where they lived, but I don't have 100% documentation on 2 of those African women. So that's why I say there's 2 names I cannot, and that's like that little 10% out there that I'm not sure who they are. But for the most part, we know exactly who they are. And we know their descendants, but there's still many, many others that have not yet been discovered.
I guess, and I don't want to harp on the issue, but I want people to understand that these were children.
Yes.
These were children.
No, they were children because of the date, how long they lived.
Right.
Life wasn't that long back then, but if you lived to 70 or 80 years old, which Margaret Cornish, who was my husband's grandmother, she actually lived that long. She owned her own home in the 1960s and 70s. She owned her own home. She worked for herself. Her children were free. It's amazing. When did we ever hear that in history?
I know, right? And after this first passage, and then the consequent many more passages that came, the reason why they could put so many people on a ship is because they were children. They were not adults. They were children.
No,
and
most
so they
of them were children.
They were packed in,
children were worth more money.
Right.
They had a longer lifespan.
Right.
They were easier to capture. The whole gamut of things.
Right.
It's really sad that the children had to be the one to endure.
Yeah, it really is. And they say, oh, no, that's not true. I said, yes, it is.
Yeah, it is.
Yes, it is. You really must do more history. So listen, I want to, it's almost on the hour, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. So is there anything else you would like to tell the students and faculty of Embry-Riddle University? Is there anything you'd like to leave with them in particular before we go?
When you're doing your dissertations as a student, there's 2 things. One, if you have something in your gut or in your heart or whatever you might believe that's telling you, whether it's in your soul, that something just isn't right, that you need to dig deeper, listen to it. Number 1, that's the most important thing, because that got me here. I had no clue, but I would be driving down a 8-lane highway in Orlando, Florida, And my brain is in Virginia with these Africans. I could not get away from them. They were in my every thought. So if you have something that is really eating at you and you can't get away from, listen to it. It's important. And the other thing I would say is when you're doing research, look for the who, the how, the when, and the why. Because and go down those roads. You can't stop and not look at that. And you need to look when you're doing genealogy. I had to look at history. History and genealogy really overlap, but history tells us who the big people are. I wanted to know what the so-called little people were, the ones that have the backbone that propelled Virginia to become a colony, and it was the Africans. Who were they? That was the importance. So look at your who, where, when, and why, and it opens up a whole new world of our history. It's so important. So that would be my little tidbit, the two things that are really important.
Well, thank you so much for sharing so much information. It's author K.I. Knight, and she is the award-winning author of Fate and Freedom, the Middle Passage books 1, 2, and 3, and Unveiled, the 20 and Odd. Thank you so much for being on the many facets of Black history for Embry-Riddle University and VyStar Credit Union. Thank you, Catherine. We'll talk again.
Yes, thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.